Welcome to the Children's Book Author Podcast. I'm your host, Eleanor Page. If you write for children, or it's always been your dream to, you're in the right place. As the children's book author, I'm on a quest to discover everything there is about writing, publishing, and marketing children's books, as well as how to supercharge my creativity, skyrocket my productivity, and absolutely everything else there is to know about how to be the best, so you can be too. Join me as I interview fabulous guests and become the children's book author. Welcome back to the Children's Book Author Podcast with me, your host, Eleanor Page. And for those of you who are listening on your favourite podcast platform, you won't know this, but today I decided to make a video intro instead of just an audio one. So for those beautiful, wonderful 20 people that watch me on YouTube, thank you, as always, for tuning in. Today you get to see my face. Yes, Sunday morning, straight out of bed, but hey, at least I have Zoom doing something with the face, and that's good enough, I say. I am so excited about today's guest, and it is Becca Syme, who is a Gallup Strengths coach. Gallup Strengths is a particular assessment that you do to find your top 5 strengths, and it really revolutionized my writing life, and I thought, well, back when I met Becca, she was probably not really starting out, but much smaller, I suppose, in her audience. And now she's huge. So, she's just amazing. She helps so many authors and does so many incredible things. And I thought, I wonder if she would make time to be on my little baby podcast. And she said yes. So I think you will gain so much from today's interview because we talk all about writing and strengths and our bad habits and our limitations, but more importantly, how to get around those things. And so fascinating for me because this interview was recorded late 2024. Can't remember the exact timing of it, but listening back to it now, which is March 2025, and I've progressed so much from when I talked to Becca, because I think she's one of these special people that just having a conversation with her makes you shift and change and transform. And we talk a bit about that. Actually, we talk a lot about transformation and about how it's not as easy as we think. It was really eye-opening for me because I tend to think transformation is quite simple, and sometimes it is and can be quite simple. And other times when I'm struggling for months and years and wondering why I haven't transformed when I'm all about transformation, well, because maybe it's not so easy to change our habits and our way of being and the way our brain does things and handles things and patterns and all that stuff. But having said all that, since talking to Becca, I'm just like back to writing like a crazy person. For me, probably that's how I was pre-COVID. And then COVID came along and maybe it did impact me more than I realized. Also, my children were at those end years of school, which was quite intense. And now they've both finished. And so here I am just writing. And listening back to this interview, to my old self interviewing Becca, was like, wow, that is so interesting. So, I mean, I wonder, you're not recording yourself, but I wonder if you could look back, if you had the ability to look back to the earlier you that might have listened to, episode 1 of this podcast or even today's podcast. And in 6 months' time, where will you be because of what you heard on this podcast, which, you might just take for granted. I know I do, but every podcast interview does change me, even a little, makes me think, oh, I could do that. Or it makes me think, oh, hold on. Why was I doing that way? Or, all these things. So listen to today's podcast with an open mind. Definitely go do the Strengths Finder test. Go get coaching with Becca if you need it. She's amazing. She will help you get past those blocks. And there is really, if you are truly passionate about being a long-term or even a short-term writer, there is nothing to stop you from moving through those hurdles that come up. And I remember having conversations with book publishers and things years ago about sort of insider things, about particular big blockbuster writers who wrote book one and then couldn't write book two. And so then they got it ghostwritten and just put that person's name on the front of every cover. So the challenges to writers, book after book, time after time, over a long period of time, are very real. In fact, in some ways, I think as the more time goes on, the more different kinds of blocks come up. And it's talking to Becca kind of made me feel like, you know what, that's okay. You can work through that. And maybe if, that's what you manage to achieve and you're done, then that's good too. But we're human. So listen to this interview, enjoy it thoroughly. Thank you so much, as always, for tuning in to the show. I am so grateful for having people who care what I or my guests have to say about writing and book publishing. I know there's a lot of diverse voices and opinions, and it's such a funny sort of industry where everybody wants to be someone and everyone's trying to take a piece of the pie and whatever. But I hope at the end of the day that you can find some peace, some truth. You can learn through the vulnerability that's shared on this show and build a career that suits you, not anybody else. Whatever it is for you, that's really all that matters. So thank you once again for tuning in. Thank you for watching my video, for those of you that did. And I'll see you on the next episode. Right, so welcome back to the Children's Book Author Podcast. And today I have a secret guest. Actually, why do I call her secret? Because so many people have said to me, have you ever thought about getting this person on your podcast? And I've gone, actually, she's booked in. So my secret guest today is Becca Syme, she holds a master's degree in transformational leadership. I love that word, transformational and leadership together, and has been a success coach, primarily utilizing the Gallup Strengthsfinder test for over 15 years. She's coached over 5,000 authors and creatives, including me, I must confess, through her Write Better Faster and Strengths for Writers classes and coaching cohorts. And she's also the author of, many of you have probably read them, the Dear Writer books. Welcome to the show, Becca.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I love the word transformational. It's one of my favorite words. And I rarely get the chance to talk to someone else all about transformation. Like everyone's sort of like, oh, yeah, transformation. And gosh, tell me everything. How did you end up doing this work? And is that what you expected to happen? Or did something lead you here? Tell me about that journey.
I never expected to be here. And in fact, just the word transformational, like, I think it's so abstract to so many people because they don't understand what the process of transformation looks like. And one of the things I did in my degree program was to study the process of transforming, almost like from a scientific perspective. Like, I did a degree that had a big focus of industrial and organizational leadership, and it was change, right? Like, how do you manage change and how do you create change in a way that produces beneficial action and takes you to the next level, right? Like, that was definitely the kind of the goal. And I think when a lot of people think of like, oh, it was transformational, like they think of like, I went to a weekend retreat. And, and that's what people say when they come away from it. But then unless they actually change, right? Like, unless something in their, life or behavior actually transforms and changes into a different form, the people around them don't take that word as seriously, because most people, when they have an epiphany or they have an enlightenment moment, their life doesn't actually change afterwards, only their understanding changes. And I think there's just such a big difference between when your actual behavior changes as a result of something that happens in your brain and you become almost like a different version of yourself, versus like when you just learn something interesting and now you just have more knowledge. Right. So I think a big piece of what I was always interested in, and part of the reason that I did that degree in the first place, is there's something about those kind of seminal experiences where, when you're a person who, I don't want to stay static, like I don't want to remain the same, you have to really go through the transformation. Like you can't just have a one moment experience. Most people, there are some people who can have those. They're very rare, but you have to really almost dig in and do hard work to get to that place of transformation. And I really wanted to understand it, not just for the organizations that I was working in, because that was primarily how I was using it, but for myself. Because of course, as part of the program, we went through the process. Like they took us through the process of transformation. And I was a different person at the beginning and at the end, in really amazing ways, in a lot of amazing ways. But I don't think people take seriously enough how hard change is. So we don't sort of consciously think, I need to go through a process like this. Most people are just like, let me just learn something. And then they think that that learning is going to change them. And generally it doesn't. They really have to kind of dig in and do some work in their brain in order to like manufacture change. So anyway, that just in an abstract way, you lighting up at that word was sort of like, yeah, I think that's because when you've had that happen or you've seen it happen to people, you know either how much reorientation it takes for them and how much it can change everything after that, if they do have like a momentary transformation, or if they do a process, like how long and hard that process can be sometimes to really become a different version of yourself. And it is, I mean, I feel like I live and breathe that thing. I love it.
But you did used to write fiction first, didn't you?
Yeah.
Or was that during?
Yep, I was a fiction writer because I was doing that sort of organizational leadership and organizational change management and stuff in my day job. Like that was what I was getting paid to do, leading organizations. I had founded a nonprofit, and that was why I went into that degree program. And I wanted to become a better, I wanted to lead the best organizations, I guess, that I possibly could, and leave organizations better because I was there, right? And so um I was doing all of that out in my, what I call my real life. And meanwhile, behind the scenes, I was trying to write novels because that was what made me happy. And I had written novels. I always knew I wanted to be a writer. Initially, after college, I had gone and done a Master of Fine Arts in creative writing and then not finished it because I didn't want to be a creative writing teacher. I wanted to write books. So I just went back into the nonprofit work and started writing books. And then eventually I got published and, was kind of on that trajectory a little bit. And then the indie publishing revolution happened. And I had this combination of being both, like I had, you know, publishers and an agent and stuff like that. So I had kind of some friends in that arena, although not a lot. I was very young in that. And then I had friends who were doing the indie route. And so I had made a lot of writer friends, and a lot of them were like, I don't know how to do this running of a business thing, And so I'm like, well, let me help you because that's what I'm doing, and let me help you be better leader of yourself in this business. And so I would use, my background and knowledge and coaching and stuff like that to help them. And it kind of got to this point, and actually the way you found me through Margie Lawson, where Margie had asked me to teach this course. And I was like, well, I can't just deliver a course on how to be a better author. I have to coach people. Like I need to be able to talk to them one-on-one. And so we did the first version of Write Better Faster, which was called Indie Author Insider, I think is what it's called. And we were individually coaching everybody. And then we're like, oh, the productivity stuff kind of started to come up a lot. So I'm like, well, let's just do a productivity class. And then that was when it just kind of skyrocketed, was when I started Write Better Faster. And um, I had intended to be a fiction writer for my whole life. Like I went full time in 2012. I fully expected that I would just be writing fiction for forever. So yeah, this was not something I ever saw myself doing. And in some ways I think I'm really a reluctant nonfiction writer, but you mentioned the 5,000 number. Like today, a couple of years later, it's 6,000. I think it's 3 years from when that bio was done. It's over 6,000, and that's individual people. So it's not just like I taught a class and 100 people took it. It's like I've individually talked to for 45 minutes plus more than 6,000 individual authors. And the reason I think that makes such a difference is that there are some patterns you can really only see when you listen to people and you don't make assumptions about them, right? Like if you talk to a big group of authors, you're talking to so many individuals that have such different experiences, and a lot of people who don't follow the common experience of whatever you're talking about are going to stay quiet. They're not going to ask questions. They're going to assume there's something wrong with them. And so what I found was you really only can see patterns by talking to a lot of individual people. And so once I started doing that at volume and I got to, I think I was at 3,500 or 3,000 or something before I was like, I mean, I feel like I should probably write a book. And actually one of my clients had said like, it would be really helpful to be able to give people something of yours, like as a way of enticing them to take Write Better Faster. Cause because it was a productivity class, they get some pushback about it. And so I wrote the first quit book I've coached a bunch of people. Here are the patterns that I see. Please stop doing all this stuff. You don't have to quit writing. Right. And then it just kind of exploded, I think, from there.
Yeah, and what's so good is you can see it in the titles. It's actually hysterical. In fact, whenever I hit a roadblock, I'm like, oh, I have to go back and read that particular Dear Writer book. And it's like you've nailed the categories, right? Because it's like, Dear Writer, and I'll just read what's after the Dear Writer. You need to quit, right? Because so many of us go, that's it. I had enough. Oh my God, I think I did that every day for the first 3 years. Thankfully, I have a little daughter who's now not so little, who used to go, don't quit, mummy, you're a great writer. So I should have had your book instead of stressing her out. Now she needs counseling, but that's a different thing, right? But so that one, Dear Writer, are you in burnout? Oh, hello. Dear writer, you're doing it wrong. Okay. Are you in writer's block every day still? Are you, dear writer, you're doing it right. And dear writer, are you intuitive? I mean, I hope they didn't deafen anybody, but they are like, you nailed it. And you're right. It was from listening to 6,000 people individually and going, oh, this again. The other thing I noticed, before I let you speak, there's so many things going on here, right? The other thing I noticed is before we got on air, it was hysterical because you looked up my notes from when you coached me 5 years ago. And as you read back to me what I had written as my blocks, like say 3 of them made me go, oh God, I still do that. And the other 2, I was like, actually, you know what? I've moved past that. So, we really are works in progress. And like you said in your, when you were talking about transformation, we can have an intent to change certain parts of ourselves, but that process, yes, it is reading your books repeatedly. It might be having some coaching, but it's not short term, is it? Or is it?
No, and it's work on your part constantly, right? Like like as a coach, and if any of you have ever played sports before, you understand this metaphor, right? Like the coach isn't on the field. The coach is off the field. So the coach is the person who has the perspective. They understand the strategy. They know they're watching, they're adjusting, they're listening, right? Like that's what good coaches do is they know they're not on the field. I'm not trying to motivate people. That's not what coaches do. Coaches are big picture, they are strategy, they are perspective. Coaches have to be ahead of you in what you're thinking. And they have to be almost like listening and paying attention to all of the signals on the field in order to be able to make those adjustments, right? And then they tell you, like, if you want this outcome, you should change this thing. But then you're actually the person who's on the field running the plays, doing the thing. Like, I can't do that work for anybody that I coach. They have they have to make the changes. So like just in particular in the course, in the Right Better Faster course, we have these two lectures that are always very like almost painful for people, right? Because it's like, okay, I got to face this thing that's always in my way and I've got to decide what I'm going to do about it. And a lot of people are like, oh, the pain of just like facing how hard this is for me to talk about. But then also, once I lighten the load and get a little perspective about it, it's like, oh, wait, I have some agency here. Like, there are some things that I can do about this. And then the coaches are there to say, here are some ideas about like how to fix this, right? But I feel like we can't underline the fact that this is never going to be easy. It is always going to be hard work. So I think when people get a certain way into this job and they recognize that it isn't this like montage of just coffee houses and words and then checks, right? Like the writing life is not a montage is sort of my like, my catchphrase right now. Um, it is so hard and it takes a lot of execution and it takes a lot of commitment and it takes a lot of pain. And I think that is not something everyone expects when they come into it. So they often get surprised by that experience. But that is the work that you did, right? To change those things that you changed. And then we're never going to run out of things. We're never going to run out of things to change, right? Because one of my profs joked during our initial kind of, the transformational leadership classes. He was like, well, what you'll learn is that you go through the process of transformation and you think you are transformed, like with a capital T. But all it is just that's this transformation. It's not like you turn into a butterfly and then you fly away and you're a butterfly for the rest of your life. It's like, no, you pull this layer off and then you go live for a while and then you got to pull that layer off and then you go live for a while because we're made to cement things, right, in our lives. And when we cement things that don't work for us, we have to break that cement apart and pull it away from ourselves and throw it away. But then there still is more cement underneath, right? So like we're never going to run out of stuff to transform ultimately. And that's, I guess, is good news and bad news. But yeah, it's work, right?
Yeah. And what's as you're talking, what's coming to me about that is I don't know if you experience this, maybe it's just a me thing, but when I'm writing any particular book, particularly nonfiction, but if even fiction for me feels like it's a bit futuristic, but futurist is my first thing on my list. We'll talk about that in a minute. But with nonfiction, as I'm writing a nonfiction book, it comes to life in my life. So it's like the lessons, the experiences, the all start to actually be everything I'm kind of doing. And then I think, I remember one time I said, maybe I should write a relationship book. And then I went, oh, maybe my relationship wouldn't survive it. I'd better not. Like because it comes to life. I don't know, maybe that's just my strengths. But have you ever experienced that happening to you?
Oh yeah, I mean, a good portion of my books, especially the nonfiction books that I write, are basically like stories either from my coaching experience or stories from my external life. Just as a for instance, the You're Doing It Wrong book starts off with me telling a story about how I got fired in 2012 and about how I heard that firing experience and realized kind of for the first time just how much my brain was being that self-critical, that self-critical brain that was telling me everything I was doing was wrong, and that I was hearing like, you are wrong because you've done this, right? And so like all of that, everything that I do, I think on some level is through story, right? It is the way that my brain makes sense of things, I think. So yeah, almost all of what I do is lived life, and then it just comes out in that kind of nonfiction space. Yeah. I think that's a very intuitive writer thing as well.
Is it? Let's talk
Yeah.
intuition straight off the bat, since you
Yep.
mentioned the word. I've several writer friends who said they tried to write and they tried to write, and until they read your intuitive, well, Are You Intuitive book, they couldn't quite get there. But now they can. And I'm huge on intuition. And I know I loved reading in your book about how there's different types of intuition. I have no spatial intuition whatsoever, none. But emotional, spiritual intuition, like, I'm on the ball. But so, what is that? How do we learn to use and trust that more as creatives and writers?
Yeah, intuition is like an autopilot, right? So it's specifically is like a full autopilot mechanism. So you're taking in information in the same way that like on a plane, autopilot sensors take in data and they're reading everything around the plane at all times and understanding how to respond to the data based on what's there. And then they formulate responses, and there are these maps, right, that the autopilot follows of like, what do you do at different points in this, whatever. And then there's the pilot that sits there and participates in this, but is almost a passive person in the experience of intuition. And this is why, like, one of the things that when you and I were talking before the started, and I was before the call started, and I was reading you some of your answers, and I stopped and I said, "Oh, you must be an intuitive writer." And it was specifically because you said the phrase, "I don't know how I do this, and I don't feel competent at it, and I don't know if I'll ever know how I understand how I do this." And I said, and I stopped and I was like, "Oh, you're an intuitive writer," because when you do something with intuition, it's often the "I don't know how I did this, but I did it" feeling, or "I don't know why the story came out this way, but it just did. And I just know this thing is supposed to happen the way it's supposed to happen." The downside of that is you don't consciously intend for that to happen. And so you don't understand how to reproduce it, right? So there's this feeling with intuitive writers of like, I have this intuition about maybe where the story should start, or what this character should do or say or feel, or what the surprise should be in this scene, or even that there should be a surprise in a scene, right? Like there are all these pieces of storytelling intuition that when they happen, we don't realize that that is also a skill that we have developed. We're just not consciously utilizing it. But the example I use in the book is that we all talk about the three-act structure and about Aristotle all the time. But Aristotle did not spring out of the ground with the three-act structure in hand. He walked around Athens and looked at, and actually there's this piece where when he talks about how he understood this, it was that there were good plays and bad plays. So there were plays that had a lot of people and that everyone wanted, they were very compelling. And then there were plays that no one wanted to watch. And he went to all the good plays and mapped out the structure. And that was how he discovered the three-act structure. Was a bunch of people were already intuitively writing stories that were good. And he discovered that the structure was already there, and then taught other people how to utilize it. So I don't think we take seriously enough what it means that the structure was there because other people were intuitively writing it. So we somehow think like if I don't know what I'm doing when I sit down at a book, that there's something wrong with me. Or if I can't explain to people how I wrote this scene, or I don't know the mechanics, or I don't know what the GMC is, or I don't whatever, that somehow I can't possibly be a good writer. When you look at the statistics, there's a significant portion, and in my experience, it's about 40% of good books that are written without any intention. Like they do some version of intuitive writing where they either just sit down and write from scratch and just keep going, or they do some version of like, we have to know the ending first, or they discover a few characters and then the story starts to tell itself. But on some level, there is this intuitive movement through the story that they don't plan, they don't outline, they don't structure. But because they can't teach other people what they're doing, they can't explain the process to other people. They feel like it's not real, or that it can't possibly produce good things. And the reality is, it's been producing good things for millennia. Like, just let it do what it needs to do, and you let it be what it is, right?
What if, like, okay, I've written 25 books very intuitively and they've done really well, but what if I can't ever do it again? You see,
Mm-hmm.
that's the real fear,
Yeah.
I think, for me as
Yeah.
an intuitive, because
Yep.
exactly what you just said, there's no formula. Like, was it because I had, done, because I do, Qigong, for example, I do, which is a Chinese medicine practice. I do all these things, I get myself in the zone, and now and if I haven't been doing those things, then oh my God, I can't actually write intuitively. Like, it's a little bit more nebulous. Whereas somebody who has that really, I've sat down, I structured it, I checked it with my developmental editor. They said it's perfectly structured. Go write your book. I feel like they have this secret advantage, but I know intuition secretly better.
I mean, I will say, like, I think there's something to be said for the fact that if you've done it successfully 25 times, the highest likelihood is that you're going to be able to do it 26. The highest likelihood is that you're going to be able to do it 27 and 28 and 29 and 30, right? Like, unless you have a traumatic brain injury, which does happen. And I have seen something like a TBI change people's brain chemistry before. Absolutely. But if you are living normal life and you're just waking up tomorrow and starting another book, there's a better than, not even average, there's a better than like high percent chance that you are going to be able to do it again. And that if you can't, there's a reason why you can't that is solvable. Like, it's very common for women in perimenopause to struggle with brain fog. And I'm literally in the middle of coaching someone where we're trying to pick apart, is it perimenopause or is it burnout? Right. And so it could be burnout that's causing this to happen, but then you'll see the catalyst. Like in perimenopause, you'll see other symptoms. In burnout, you'll see the catalyst. So it will make sense that it's not working. Or if you have something like, you have a big cross country move or you get divorced or something like that. Like, it's normal to have a sort of change in cognition, or if you're in major grief episodes or something like that. But the capacities in your brain do not deteriorate in the way that we think that they do. I think there's a lot of people who are afraid that if I don't use it, I'm going to lose it on some level. And yes, there is some alacrity that comes with doing something repetitively. But when you have that baseline capacity, if you are utilizing it on any kind of semi-regular basis, and by semi-regular, I don't mean like every other day. I mean like relatively within a year you're doing it. You know what I mean? Like, you're more likely than not likely to be able to do it again. And I get the fear, right? Like, I get that fear of like, what happens if it doesn't come through? But I would answer that question. What happens if it doesn't come through for you is that you will find something else to do. And it will be sad that you had that capacity and now don't have it anymore. And you will grieve it, and then you'll get past it, and you will have always written those 25 amazing books. but you being afraid of it isn't going to change that one way or the other. So we might as well just open the manuscript and see what's going on, right? Because
Yes.
right? It's like, because me being afraid of it isn't going to actually make it come true or not come true. It is going to be what it is going to be. So I might as well just see what it is because I don't actually know.
Yeah. So many good things in there. Yes, yes, yes. You're absolutely right. And I loved what you said in your book about, like one of the, probably I think one of the best discoveries in psychology is, that we've discovered there's parts of us, like two parts that can actually completely conflict each other. So, it's absolutely true. There's one part that says, are you serious? Like, I've been doing intuitive work for 20 years. I can do this with my eyes shut. And the other part, just as loud, just as, influential in me, that says, but can you, and these parts can live together. So, I mean, I know you're not, an expert in any way on these parts, but in your experience, what have you observed about working with parts?
Yeah, so that's a good note. I'm not a psychiatrist, right? So I'm not an expert in internal family systems as a
Yes.
theory, but I am definitely an expert in strengths, right? In terms of like, and strengths are parts, essentially. They're not the only parts of us. And I do think that's important to acknowledge. Like if you've seen Inside Out, the American film Inside Out, and if you've seen the little people who run around inside your head, right? It's not like there's only 10 strengths in there and that's all you get, right? Like, no, there's, so many parts inside your head. But I am definitely an expert in the way that strengths are individually motivated and how they are individual parts inside of you. And what I've seen is not only is there no predictability, so like you can't just say, even something like Enneagram doesn't predict what strengths you have, and strengths don't predict what Enneagram you are. What disc you are doesn't predict what strengths you have, and vice versa. So it is literally that there's so much complication inside of our brains. We're an infinitely complex. So you can have parts that don't even seem to go together. Like you can have, and even just strengths in particular, you can have a command strength, which is like clarity, you know, ordering people, things like that. Like this must be this way, and harmony, which is like, let's all just get along and everyone be very, in peace together. Those two strengths appear to conflict. And sometimes in your brain they will, but you can still have them because there's no requirement that you are internally a monolith. Like, and I don't think we understand that, because what would make us happy is if there was no internal conflict. We would prefer it if there was no internal conflict, because we don't always know how to solve that, especially because when one part gets behind the driver's seat, it often acts as though it's the only part. So like what you were talking about with the intuition, where there's a part that knows you're intuitive and a part that's worried what happens if it doesn't deliver. The part that's worried when it's behind the driver's seat is the only one that's talking, right? And so that's one of the problems, is that you kind of have to remind yourself like, oh, this is just a part of me that's talking right now. And I don't want to disintegrate it, right? I don't want to like put it in the basement and lock it in a room. And, we don't want to disintegrate. We always want to stay integrated. But I do want to acknowledge that sometimes I need to give my achiever a cookie and put it off of the driver's seat and put somebody else in the driver's seat, because everybody needs to get some airtime in your strengths and your parts. And when one part is being really, really loud, it's usually because of fear, like it's afraid of something. And almost always fear is only provable by action. You can't logically prove fear is wrong. So the downside is we want to logically think and prove fear wrong, but that only feeds it. So we have to take some kind of action to prove fear wrong. Anyway, I'm getting very into this, but yes, I do think that internally conflicted parts are really, really normal. And it's not a signal that there's anything wrong with us. It's just a signal that we are in fact human.
Yeah, it's great the way you said that, to really acknowledge which part is in the driver's seat. I think that's actually really empowered information, isn't it? To recognize
Yeah.
there's different parts is like the first step, but to actually go, ooh, this is the part that's in the seat today. And that I love that you can only really get past fear by taking action. It's so true. I see that with my kids all the time. I'm like, you can't think your way out of this. You have to go and do it. And then you'll see if you like it, don't like it, if it's hard, if you la, 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 la. But do. So that's really solid advice. Let's talk a little bit about the StrengthsFinder test. So a lot of people may not have done it, don't know what we're talking about. So give us a little bit of the background of what that is and why you particularly chose it as your thing. What did you love about it?
Yeah, I grew up in a household where the three people that I grew up with, who I loved, my parents and my sister, were very similar to each other in their brains. And then I was the weird one. And I don't know that they would have necessarily called me that, although I'm sure they would have. But I was the one who didn't fit the mold. And so I kind of grew up with this who knows what's going to happen to me? I can't be successful in the way everybody else is. I don't understand myself, etc. And when I did this transformational leadership degree, we got coached by a strengths coach as part of our entrance into this master's program. And I walked into that room believing one thing about myself and believing that I'd be really lucky kind of if just to give you a context, I had a 3 point, oh boy, 4.25 GPA, I think, like a 3.425. I graduated in the bottom 25% of my class. So I was not what you would call someone that they expected to be a smart academic person when I, finished school, but it really was. And I learned why later, like why strategics commonly struggle with that kind of stuff, just because anyway, side note. Um, but I walked into that room believing one thing about myself. And when my coach started talking to me about what my strengths were, and I was like, well, that explains literally everything about my life and also explains why I have not been able to make these other tactics work for me and why I struggle so much with this. So I have to know everything. Number one, input, right? Input is like the information gatherer. I have to know everything about this immediately. And what I found about it, which really is the reason that I stayed in strengths, is that unlike other personality tests, which was one person deciding there are 4 or 6 or 9 or 15 or 16 or whatever, however many types of people, rather than someone external deciding there are this many types of people, it was let's go and study what we want to reproduce. So let's go and find the most successful people in the world and let's interview those people and find out how they did what they did. So let's not make any assumptions about it. Let's just go, ask. And so they did all this research coding to try to align the patterns of how people were successful to see if there was any underlying patterns underneath. And it turns out that there were. And they made these different strengths where these specific talents would always occur together when they occurred. And they would be very, very strong. And so there are 34 of the strengths, and you get your top 5. And then you get an order from 1 to 34 of what are you the best at? And then what is not at all going to be on your radar in your bottom strengths. Not your weaknesses, by the way, because your weaknesses are your top 5 strengths. which
Are they?
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Yep.
God, I'm dying to know what that means, but keep going.
So a strength is like nuclear power. It can either power a valley or blow it up, right? So it is as powerful as can be, but it doesn't always work for you. So sometimes it works against you. So I'll just use one of yours as an example. You have a number 1 futuristic strength. Futuristic, as everyone would assume, is about looking at the future, but it's not just that. Futuristics live in the future. The future is real to them. So when they're planning for something to happen, They're actually living in that place where it's already happened. So a lot of futuristics have to sort of come back to the present moment, right? But if you are extremely futuristic to a point where it's working against you, you are never present. You're always thinking about the future. All the decisions that you're making have only to do with the future, and you're disconnected on some level from the present. That's probably less of an issue for you because, oddly enough, you have high adaptability, which is the opposite of futuristic. And what happens with adaptability is it is the extreme present moment focused people. So it is, I go with the flow. I'm always ready for adaptation. When something comes at me, I just respond to it. No big deal, right? Whereas a lot of people with high futuristic tend to have,
Mm.
I would say probably more than 50% of futuristics have low adaptability. So they like to plan, they like to think about the future, but they struggle to adapt because they're not as present in the moment. But you having these two very opposite strengths means that you're probably more present moment focused than the average futuristic and probably more friendly with planning than the average adaptability. And so you kind of get like this hybrid version a little bit of that stronger version of that strength because it had an opposite working on it. But the strengths themselves are both your biggest strengths, but we don't stop there because if you don't clear up that sort of nuclear power that can blow up things, then you're just going to go around exploding everything around you all the time instead of, powering everything around you.
That makes so much sense. I never saw it that way. I know that my, last one is discipline. And I go, oh, oh, oh. That's the very, very, very number 34, whatever it is. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But that's so fascinating that I've never saw it that way, that your top five can actually, be good and bad. And you nailed me. That description is perfect. The adaptability and the futuristic thing. I mean, I'm the person that people come to for coffee cup readings. I'll tell you your future, mate. And I'm like 9 out of 10 times but I'm into it. I'm into the future very, very, very much. So, so interesting. So what sort of other top strengths do you see in like writers or creatives? Are there, I mean, I'm sure everybody is everything, but like what
Yeah.
other sort of things come up a lot that can help or hinder authors or creative people?
Yeah, a couple of the ones we see a lot. I mean, what you said is true. We've seen extremely successful writers with every single strength.
Mm.
Like, so there is no I think a lot of people, when they hear about personality tests, they're used to kind of their workplace type of personality test where like, and there's sort of a joke among facilitators who do personality stuff with companies where every company has a best preference,
Mm.
right? So like if you go into a company and you're doing something like Myers-Briggs, every company has an archetype of Myers-Briggs that they would think is the best version of a person. And everybody's archetype's a little bit different, right? And so a lot of people are used to like, oh, there's an ideal though. Like there's an ideal set of strengths. And I'm like, no, really, there is no ideal set of strengths. Not just you have outlier people who are successful with every strength, you have legitimately a pattern of success with every single strength. And the reason I do think that's so important is there are some strengths like achiever, right? Where a lot of people would look at an achiever objectively and think, oh, achievers work so hard because that's part of what they do well, right? Well, it must be that achievers are better at being writers than people who don't have achiever. So I better go looking for my achiever. And if I don't have it high, I'm not going to be able to
Mm.
be a good writer or run a good business. And I would say false. Only 20% of people have achiever. It is one of the most commonly occurring strengths, but it still is only 20% of people.
Mm.
So you do not need to have it dominant in order to, because any strength can work hard if you motivate it correctly. But there definitely are some places that we see authors struggle more consistently. There's a strength called intellection, which is the most common strength among writers. Like it's
Mm.
number one in occurrence. And 57% of writers have intellection, which doesn't,
Wow.
it is a lot, right? Like that's a very high number, but it also doesn't mean you need to have it in order to be a good writer. It's
I didn't
just
even
that
see that on my list. Was that on there? Isn't
I
that funny?
can't, and I
Wow.
only have your top five, so
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
not sure
yeah.
if
It's
I'm
so
not sure where it is,
curious.
but
Intellectual.
intellection is wanting to think over and over something,
Mm.
right? Like, and so they tend to be processors. They tend to like to have a lot of time to think about things. These are the type of people who, when you tell them something in a meeting, they have an opinion about it like 2 days later. And then they think like, oh, I wish I had been able to say that in the meeting. And I'm like, well, you won't ever be able to do that unless people give you 2 days to think about it. So get the information 2 days ahead of time, and then you'll be brilliant in the meeting because you will have had time to think about it first, right? So, but that's kind of the typical, way that intellection shows up. The pain point when you're a writer is that most intellections struggle with beginnings of books and
Uh-huh.
beginnings of writing sessions. And so they can really have a hard time when they get into the writing with feeling like they know what's going on, because most intellections have kind of a nebulousness about the beginnings of things. And so it takes them a long time to have kind of clarity about what's really going on and what people are. And this might happen in transitions between like one act and another act, or at turning points in a novel. It happens a lot. It happens almost all the time at either 50 or 60% when you're doing that. Okay, now we've opened all the loops. We got to close all the loops, right? They tend to stall in those places. But the problem is they think that's all problematic. So they think
Ah.
that it's a signal that they're dumb or that they're bad writers or they're lazy. But the reality is your brain is made to turn things over and to think about things. So the best way that your brain is going to function is if you think about things, right? So we want you to be using that strength to think, but then you have to shepherd it correctly, because a lot of intellection people will get frustrated that they can't write at the beginning of a session, and then they'll go to Facebook because they're frustrated that the words aren't coming out. And they don't realize how much that, and or TikTok or Instagram or whatever, they don't realize that that particular trait of theirs is being preyed upon by people who are making money off of them. And so they just end up going to Facebook, right? Or to Instagram, and they don't realize that there's another way to be. And so we try to work with them and do things like, don't reach for your phone first thing in the morning, last as long as you can in the day before you go on social media, go for a walk in the morning, do some brain dumping if you need to, phone a friend to talk about your book. A lot of intellections will balk at that because they'll be like, whoa, talking. No, that's the opposite of what I want to do. But intellection needs pressure. So
Mm.
it needs either like a deadline, or the idea needs to push at you, or there needs to be clarity, or it needs to have the time to think. And because of the productivity industrial complex, we don't like giving our brains time to think because it feels quote unquote unproductive. And one of the big catchphrases we repeat constantly, our motto really, is thinking is working, because so many intellection writers need to know that when you're thinking about your book, you're still working on it,
Mm.
but the thinking should always produce writing at some point. So the goal is to open the manuscript every day, ask if you know what the next sentence is. Like, don't ask, do you know what happens next? Because most intellectuals will be like, well, I know what happens next. And I'm like, okay, what's the next sentence? And they're like, oh, never mind. I don't know what happens next. So ask if you know what the next sentence is. If you know what it is, write it. If you don't, think about it, or ask yourself what you don't know yet so that you can start heading in the direction of thinking about the scene. But something like that is not intuitive for us to do because of the way that the rest of the world is structured and the way that
Mm.
people talk about productivity, and the way that a lot of productivity gurus talk about thinking is very derogatory. And so
Yeah.
we don't naturally want to do it, but our brain needs it if we have that strength.
Oh, such good insight. Go do the test and find out if you've got that. I think I did look it up as you were talking. It's number 17. So it's down a
So it's
little.
reachable for you.
Yeah, yeah,
And you
yeah.
have enough other thinking strengths, like ideation and futuristic and strategic are all thinking strengths as well. So
Mm.
like there's a higher likelihood that you'll be able to utilize something that's also a thinking strength, like intellection, if you need it.
Yeah, but they're in categories. So there's
Hmm.
strategic strengths, there's relationship.
Relationship,
What are the other two?
executing,
Okay.
executing and influencing.
Yeah, so executing's really low for me on everything. The
That's okay.
execution. Too
That's
much
okay. You're
thinking.
getting plenty done.
But yeah, just I love that you said work out what motivates each of those. It's almost like, discovering them. It isn't just to go, oh, how, because we love, as you say, to do tests and go, oh, how interesting, I'm that, me, I'm that. And we love that. That's great. Okay, fantastic. I'm so futuristic. La la la. I'll skip around for the rest of the day. But
Yeah.
and but is negates everything I just said. Hello. You got to really discover what motivates and how to work around that. Now that I know how to say it's kind of strength weakness, so that it doesn't, and it works for you. And that's, really is the best way to do that through, some sort of coaching on that, so that you
Yeah.
can really get your process solid.
Yeah, we do have a set of individual strengths videos that we have made that can be helpful. But I would, after you take the test, I would watch them. I wouldn't watch them before because then the way the test is constructed is a very sensitive instrument.
Mm.
And so it's going to respond to your having learned about them if
Mm.
you learn about them. So I would say if this at all sparks your interest, go take the test immediately and just take the top 5. Don't do the full 34 unless you really want to spend the money for it. Because if you don't resonate with the theory, I don't want you to spend extra money that you don't need to spend. So take the top 5 test. In fact, you can just Google Clifton Strengths top 5, and then it should take you directly to the page for that. And I would take the Clifton Strengths top 5, or essentially the Clifton Strengths test, get your top 5, and then read the report, because the report itself tells you enough about the individual strengths that if you are already able to translate that into writing, then go ahead. And if not, if you go to betterfasteracademy.com/links, we have a bunch of videos that you can watch if you want them. And yes, we definitely do coaching. Like, please feel free to contact us. But I do think that the best way to do this is to use the report, what you know about yourself. They do have some action point steps on the report as well. Thankfully, they changed the report recently, so it's a little bit more user friendly. So it has some really good individualized information to you also, which is fascinating. If you take your top 5 strategic, oh, we both have strategic at 3. If you take your top 5 strategic at 3 and my top 5 strategic at 3, the reports won't read the same
Oh, really?
because the reports are individualized to whatever your other strengths are. So your strategic
Oh.
report would have a little bit of futuristic, a little bit of ideation, a little bit of positivity, a little bit of adaptability. Mine would have a little input, a little connectedness, a little individualization, a little significance in it, right? So like, because those are my other top 5. So our strategics would read different because they are changed by what's around them.
Yeah, so fascinating. Well, out of all the things I've done, I must admit, I always come back to the Clifton Strengths one whenever I, quote, lose myself. It's like I come back, it's like coming back to home and reminding myself, oh, you silly person, this is who you are. How'd you forget? It's that sort of almost coming home to yourself, because, as you so succinctly said, there's so many experts and gurus, and each of them is teaching their own approach rather than that individualized approach. And it can, yeah, it's kind of problematic. I see, why they do it, because it makes sense. But at the same time, somebody follows that and goes, this is not working for me. And they try so hard, and then they really internalize that as there's something wrong with them. Then, oh, I hate to see that. Yeah.
Yeah, the tagline on my podcast is anyone can tell you what worked for them, and they can say it might not work for you, but they can't tell you why. I can tell you why. And the reason that tagline exists is because when we listen to people talk, especially experts talk, we assume that they're teaching us truths about the industry. all they're doing is teaching us about their own experience. Even people who say they're teaching us truths about the industry, almost 100% of the time are teaching you about their own experience. It really takes something that is extremely objective to be able to teach you an actual truth about how the actual world works, right? So it's so important for us to remember that everything we are learning is very subjective and relative. And if it's not resonating with us, there's a reason other than that I am wrong and need to change myself. It's usually you need to stop listening to that thing that is making you feel like you're wrong, even if that thing is me, right? Because not everybody is into personality tests. Not everybody is into strengths. If they like personality tests, some people just don't like strengths. And if it's not resonating with you, then I encourage you to ignore me because it's not for you. It's okay to just listen to our intuition in that way.
And you have that sentence, is it, correct me if I say it wrong, which is like everything you hear, question the premise. Is that the way you say it? Question
Yep.
the premise, question the premise.
100%.
I love that because it's yeah, speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, it is. Everything that happens for a reason, but sometimes that reason is I was tired or had bad shrimp, right? So like sometimes the things that happen or the things that I hear, or and this specifically, it's like the things that other people do, that success happened for a reason, sure, but it's probably not the reason they're telling you it is. So like the example I use a lot is what is it? Write every day, right? Is the
Mm.
thing that you hear a ton in advice circles, or no, it's don't edit as you go. This is the big one. Because the reason people say, so you're questioning the premise means someone gives you a piece of advice and for some reason it's not resonating or it's not working. Or at this point, I just question everything. So I don't even initially accept things that are told to me because I know there's always some reason why this thing is happening that isn't what they say it actually is. So let's say someone tells you you can't edit as you go. And you're like, well, everyone repeats this. It must be true. And then Becca comes along and is like, well, let me tell you about the group of people who edit in their head instead of on the page. Because the assumption that we're making when we say, don't edit as you go, you can't edit a blank page is the big thing that gets repeated, right? You can't edit a blank page. People edit blank pages all the time. They edit in their head before they ever write. And for some people, if they are functioning more like bread machine writers, they have this the mechanism internally that makes them edit things before they put it on page. Whereas like a bread machine where you put everything in and click it closed, and then the bread just cooks and mixes and everything inside. And then when it dings and it opens, you have a loaf of bread that's ready to make a sandwich. With some writers, if you make them put the words on the page before they've had a chance to really cogitate, that's like putting unbaked bread on a plate and trying to make a sandwich out of it. You're going to have to take a hair dryer and dry out the bread with a hair dryer, which is going to take you 100 hours to do when you could have just left it inside the bread machine to cook and let it finish baking the bread before you took it out. But because most people don't understand the way that a strength like that, or because it doesn't come from just one strength, it really is a combination of like brain chemistry and lots of different things. But when I'm a person who edits as I go, because I am actually editing in my head before I put it on page, as I write, I know that I am that way. And then that means I do not listen because I've questioned the premise of why would someone give me this advice? Well, it turns out that advice doesn't apply to everybody. And it turns out there are really valid reasons why people should not listen to it. And the first thing I will always say is whenever you hear a piece of advice, when anyone says everyone does this, can you find any people who don't do that who are successful? And P.S. spoiler alert, I can tell you 100% of advice. I can tell you there are people where there's an exception to the rule, including things like don't edit as you go, write every day, writers write. You have to do direct sales. You have to do TikTok. You have to do Facebook ads. You have to be New York. You have to be indie, whatever it is. Any piece of advice you get from anyone, there's always a reason why that advice aligns with a certain group of people, and then a reason why it does not align with really anyone else. But the problem is the advice is always put forth as gospel.
Mm.
So we tend to think of like it's righteous to not edit as you write. So then we're telling ourselves, if I'm editing as I go, I'm doing it wrong. So I have to stop that because I'm doing it wrong. And that's again why I wrote that book. It's like, you're not doing it wrong. You're doing it correctly. They are the wrong person for you to listen to.
Yeah.
So questioning the premise often means, and I've questioned the premise of stuff that I eventually come back to believe. So it's not like you just question and discard everything.
Mm-hmm.
For some of us, you actually need to listen to that advice. It's the correct advice. But for a lot of us, it just doesn't work that way. And it's put forth as though it's 100% of writers. And it actually ends up being more like 25 to 30% of writers.
Yeah, that's so powerful. You know, when like Stephen King says you have to write every day, and everyone's like, you have to write every day. Otherwise, you're not, like, oh. And some people just like to do bouts, like they write something and then, especially children's book authors, because they might write a whole bunch of stuff and then they might spend a year doing school visits or something, to actually get that stuff out. And books, especially fiction books, are evergreen. So it's not like they're going to go out of fashion, or like, so you can be promoting them around the world. You can write one book and promote it around the world for the rest of your life and never write anything again. And
yeah, especially because like in terms of marketing and promotion, there are so many people who can't write and promote at the same time. So like it is a really big misnomer that I think a lot of people believe, well, I should be writing all the time, because even like someone would listen to you just say that about, the promotion at the schools, and they'd be like, well, you should be writing when you're in the hotel on that school visit. And I'm like, no, not everyone's brain functions that way. It's not beneficial for everyone. If you are wired that way, by all means, go for it. Like do that thing. But if you are not wired that way, you should absolutely not be doing it.
yeah, exactly. I wanted to ask,
Mhm.
what do you see is like some of the main things that come up around writer's block in particular?
Mm.
Because, there's people that say writer's block's not real, and there's people that say writer's block is real. And just even those two sentences, I think, are so stupidly basic that then the person gets stuck on. So is it real or is it not real?
Yeah, I would say the problem with when people say like there's no such thing as writer's block is that they're assuming because it doesn't exist for them, it can't possibly exist for anyone else. So I would say if it doesn't exist for that person who's speaking, wonderful for them, great. I'm not them. It for sure exists for me. But the difference is I don't see writer's block as a problem, because every time my brain gets blocked about something, it's always making progress in the story. And because I know how, like, I have a strategic strength, for instance, what commonly happens when strategics get blocked is that they'll have a whole bunch of different pathways that the story can potentially take in their head. And they have to kind of stop and work through each one of those pathways. Or if an intellection gets blocked, it's really common that they'll have this kind of nebulous future that's happening, or there'll be like a blip in the story. Like, I know what happens here and I know what happens here, but between those two things, something's got to happen. So they have this hole that they don't know how to fill, and they have to think about it, right? There are some empathy writers who will get blocked because they have the characters are having big emotions and they don't want to have to write those emotions because they're going to have to sit in that negative space with that character. And so they'll sometimes just get blocked because they don't want to go sit in that space. And they might have to work through some of the emotions in their external life, like their environment first, to have kind of like some runway emotionally before they can sit down and start writing those big emotions for that character. So there are all kinds of reasons why people get blocked. The thing I do agree with when people say there's no such thing as writer's block is that there's no such thing as something you can't overcome. Like there's no such thing, even if it's something that happens to you because you have brain fog, or that there's something that's, not working in your brain, like you had long COVID or something like that, right? Like there's always some element of some progress that you can make at any time, even if the progress is, I'm not going to force myself to think about this today because my brain needs me to do other things, or like I need to find some certainty in my outer life first before I can go back into my inner creative space. There's no such thing as a moment that won't pass. And I think the reason people say there's no such thing as writer's block is they have a particular type of personality that either doesn't get blocked, or that thinks if we consider something as a block, we're somehow, yeah, I don't know why Zoom does that.
Balloons just flew across the screen for those who can't.
If we're considering something as a block, that somehow our negative thinking about it is causing some kind of reality to exist about it. And so if we just believe that the blocks don't exist, then they won't exist. And I'm like, you can believe all you want that the blocks don't exist, but unless you figure out how to solve the problems your brain is having in each one of those moments, if you're a person who has writer's block, you're not going to be able to get past it until you figure out how to solve it. So let's figure out what your brain actually needs at that moment, and then just give it the thing that it needs. Because if it needs time or space or quiet or clarity, or it needs to talk to somebody or do some research, or sometimes people need to do things like, I mean, I did a whole book called The Author Stuck List that was just about how do you get yourself unstuck when you're stuck. And the whole point is your brain has a pattern behind you of what's worked in the past. And you need to use those strategies first to get yourself unstuck. So, like, some people need perspective. They need to draw out the physical space that they're writing in because there's some kind of physical block. Some people need the emotional clearing. Some people need to have a nap and a snack. Some people need to move their pre-order. Like there's all these things that might be causing us to be stalled or halted. But yes, writer's block is real, but it's not real in the sense of like this mythical, unfathomable, unbeatable beast that's out there. It's like, oh no, it's a solvable thing. You just have to know how to solve whatever it is that's going on in your brain.
Yeah, I love that. The Author Stuck List. What a great title, from having coached 6,000 people, all the things you've seen that have made authors get stuck. And I love that you said there's a solution for each and every one of them. You just need to find
everything.
And you said it so beautifully earlier too, which was, if the solution is you're done with this now, you've written 25 books and you never write another one, that's okay. Maybe you're supposed to go off and do something else. Sometimes that might genuinely, be the reality, because there can be that stubbornness in people that they've wasted all that time. It's not so much, I wouldn't call it give up, but change to something that might be, maybe their strengths have grown them to the next level. I'll often look at my strengths and be like, oh, there's so much strategic. Should I be running some major company or something, rather than writing a little children's book, So, maybe you progress to something else that makes you happier in life. That's okay.
Yeah. And if there's like, we can kind of take the Christopher Reeve approach, right? Which is like, there's no obstacle I can't overcome, even something that takes away the thing that I want the most, right? And for me, it's like there's always a thing that transforms into a new thing, and energy changes all the time, right? Like life changes, the world changes, everything changes, and the more resistant we are to change, the more we need everything to stay the same in order for ourselves to be happy, the more unhappy we're going to be. And again, I think there's this element of we think that a thing has to be a certain way in order for us to get what we want. But the thing that the human race is the worst at in the world is predicting what will make us happy. That's actually the thing we're the worst at.
Really?
Because oh yes, yep. And there are so many studies that have been done about this, about the way that we predict what will make us happy. Most of the time, what we're actually predicting is what will make us not afraid anymore. But that doesn't actually work. because in order for us to not be afraid anymore, we have to actually soothe the fear. What's going to make us happy so often is just creating moments of happiness on our own. So like the walk you take with your kid, or the afternoon tea you have with your parent or something like that. Those are going to be the things that when you look back on your life, you wish you had more of. Very, very few people are going to wish they had spent more hours working when they're at the end of their life. But we so often in the moment think that more work is going to make us happy. All more work is going to make us do is more work. Like that's all it's going to do.
What a beautiful place to finish. I don't want to say another word after that. Like that was just, happiness. Strive for that. Sort out the little bits along the way. And you got this. Go write your next book. If you want to. If you've got blocks, you know who to contact now. So, but no, that's been just amazing exploring the Strengthsfinder and just your knowledge in this area. And you've made so many resources and things for people so that I don't want to use the word that there's no excuses, but so there's no obstacles.
There's no reason.
Yeah, no reason.
Yeah, there's no obstacle. Yeah.
There's a solution for everything. And you really have thought of it all. So all the links will be in the show notes. Thank you so much for your expertise and your heart and your intellect. I don't know where intellect is on your list, but it must be pretty high. But yeah, it's just been an absolute joy. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Did you find that interview valuable? Great! Now be an awesome human and go and leave a review because it helps the podcast out so much. Want to read the show notes? Check out thechildren'sbookauthorpodcast.com. Want to find out more about me, Eleanor Page? Find me at eleanorpage.com or come and say hello on social at Eleanor Page Books. Until next time, keep writing and keep learning.